You think my past is too heavy, but tonight, I'll carry it for you. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, sunlight filtering through tall, dusty windows, casting golden stripes across worn wooden tables. He sat in the corner, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. The world outside moved in hurried bursts, but inside, time seemed to slow, a gentle reprieve he hadn't realized he needed. That's when he noticed her. She moved with a kind of quiet grace that caught his attention immediately. Not the kind of grace that demanded eyes on her, but the subtle, unstudied kind, the way she adjusted her scarf with a deliberate slowness, the soft sway of her hair as she reached for a book on the shelf. Her presence seemed almost impossible to ignore, and yet it wasn't intrusive. There was something fragile beneath the poised exterior, something that made him want to know her story without ever prying. She sat by the window, a stack of papers and a laptop before her. Her brow furrowed slightly as she reviewed her work, and he noticed the faint tension in her jaw, the quiet sigh she tried to suppress. It was a small, human detail, and it pulled at him. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to bridge the gap between their solitary worlds. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and vanilla, the warm aroma wrapping around them like a soft blanket. He watched as she stirred her tea, the spoon tapping gently against the porcelain cup. For a moment, she caught his glance and paused, her eyes meeting his across the room. There was a flicker there, fleeting, hesitant, yet unmistakable. A spark of acknowledgement, as if she sensed his curiosity but wasn't ready to welcome it fully. He noticed the subtle ways she carried herself, the small gestures that spoke volumes. The way her fingers lingered on the book's spine before opening it, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. The careful placement of her bag on the chair beside her, as though protecting it from the world. And when she shifted slightly, a soft exhale escaping her lips, he felt a pang of empathy. He wanted to tell her, without words, that he understood. That he saw. He sipped his coffee again, slower this time, just to prolong the shared silence between them. Each time their eyes met, he felt a gentle tug at his chest, a curious mixture of longing and caution. It was a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight, a beginning, fragile yet undeniable. There was no rush. No overt action, no clumsy attempts at charm. Just a recognition of another human being, equally guarded yet silently reaching out. And in that soft, suspended pause, he thought, maybe tonight, she won't have to carry it all alone. The cafe hummed with life around them, but in that corner, a slow, imperceptible connection had begun, a meeting of glances, of unspoken questions, and the first stirrings of something neither had expected. The next evening, the streets glowed under the soft orange of street lamps, and the world felt quieter somehow, more intimate. He found himself thinking about her, the way she had tucked her hair behind her ear, the faint tremor in her fingers as she had organized her papers. He hadn't even spoken to her, yet the image lingered, tugging at something inside him he didn't quite understand. By chance, or perhaps fate, their paths crossed again at the same cafe. She carried a stack of books larger than seemed reasonable for one person, the strap of her bag cutting into her shoulder. For a moment, he hesitated, watching her wrestle with the load. Something in him stirred, that instinct to help, to ease a burden he had not yet fully comprehended. "Here, let me," he said, his voice soft, careful not to startle her. She paused, eyes flickering up, guarded. There was a brief silence, a gentle wariness in the way she measured him. Her lips pressed together, almost imperceptibly, as if deciding whether to accept the intrusion into her carefully held independence. Finally, a subtle nod, and he moved closer. The moment his hands brushed against hers as he lifted the stack, a shiver ran up his arm. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet electric, a spark that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He noticed the warmth of her skin, the delicate texture of her hands, the way she unconsciously leaned slightly toward him as the weight shifted from her arms to his. "I can manage," she murmured, half protest, half invitation. He didn't argue, just smiled gently. There was no need to. She had allowed him into her small world for a fleeting instant, and that alone was enough. As he held the books, he felt the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the quiet steadiness beneath the tension, and an odd sense of closeness bloomed between them. They walked together toward her table, the sounds of the cafe fading into the background, the clink of cups, the soft murmur of other patrons, the occasional rustle of papers. He was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the gentle sway of her movement, the scent of her hair mingling with the warm cafe air. It was intimate, yet entirely safe, like stepping into a quiet corner of the world where only they existed. Finally, he placed the books on her table. Her fingers lingered on the edge of his hand for a heartbeat longer than necessary. That brief touch said more than words could, a fragile acknowledgement, a shared understanding. She looked up at him, her eyes softening, a faint smile curving her lips. "You didn't have to," she said, though there was gratitude woven into her words. "I wanted to," he replied simply, letting the sincerity rest between them. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in the eyes of the world, yet it shifted something unseen, a gentle nudge toward trust. The subtle intimacy of helping someone carry their burden, without fanfare, without expectation, had quietly bound them together. As he returned to his seat, he realized he had been holding his breath without knowing it. And for the first time, he wondered, what else could he carry for her, if only she let him? A few days later, the cafe had become a quiet anchor in their lives, a place that felt suspended outside the rush of the world. He arrived early, the familiar scent of coffee and aged wood comforting him, and noticed she was already there, curled up with her laptop. Her expression was concentrated, almost tense, and he sensed there was more beneath the surface than just work. As he approached, she looked up, offering a small, polite smile. That smile didn't mask the subtle fatigue in her eyes, the quiet weight she carried that had nothing to do with the books or papers scattered around her. He sat across from her without asking, a gentle presence rather than a disruption, and watched her for a moment. "You look busy," he said softly, careful not to intrude. She shrugged, fingers pausing on the keyboard. "Something like that," she replied, voice calm but edged with weariness. He sensed it, the layers she kept carefully folded, the parts of herself that didn't travel well through casual conversation. There was a vulnerability there, and he didn't want to pry, only to acknowledge it. Minutes passed in companionable silence, punctuated by the soft clatter of cups and the low hum of conversation. Then, without any announcement, she exhaled heavily, leaning back in her chair. "I've been dealing with a lot," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her gaze dropped to the table, fingers twisting a corner of her notebook. "Things I don't really let anyone see." He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words settle in the air between them. "You don't have to talk about it," he said gently. "Just let me be here. That's enough." Her eyes met his, wide and slightly startled. The quiet sincerity in his voice seemed to pierce the careful armor she wore. For a moment, she hesitated, as though weighing the risk of letting him in against the comfort of remaining alone. Then, finally, she leaned slightly closer, a silent invitation to witness her truth. I'm not always easy to be around," she admitted, voice low, almost trembling. "I've made mistakes. Hurt people. And sometimes it feels like, carrying it all is just easier than letting anyone close." He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against her hand, a tentative, grounding gesture. The touch was brief but deliberate, a small bridge between her isolation and the quiet warmth he offered. She flinched slightly at first, then allowed herself to rest her hand against his, the tension easing ever so slightly. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said softly. I'll carry it tonight, if you'll let me." Her lips parted in a quiet exhale, and for the first time, he saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction, as though some of the invisible weight she carried had shifted. There was a fragile trust in that small moment, the beginning of an emotional intimacy that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations, only the silent assurance that someone saw her, fully and without judgment. Outside, the afternoon sun began to wane, casting a warm glow across the table. Inside, in that quiet corner, the space between them softened. The emotional walls she had held up for so long were not gone, but for the first time, they felt negotiable, shared, and, perhaps, lighter. The following week brought a quiet tension that neither had expected. They met again at the cafe, but the easy rhythm of their previous encounter seemed fragile, as if both were suddenly aware of the unspoken gravity between them. He noticed it in the way she paused before sitting down, her hand brushing the edge of the table as if to steady herself. She looked up at him, eyes searching, hesitant, almost daring him to overstep some invisible boundary. He sensed it too, the invisible weight of attraction, unacknowledged yet undeniably present. It wasn't a desire born of urgency or impatience, it was slow, simmering, like a candle flame dancing behind a curtain. Every glance, every small gesture carried a quiet charge, the way her fingers lingered over her mug, the subtle tilt of her head when she listened to him speak, the fleeting brush of their arms as she reached for her notebook. Yet there was a barrier, too. Her self-protectiveness was tangible. He could see it in the slight tightening of her jaw when conversation drifted too close to personal territory, the quick, controlled movements as she adjusted her scarf or smoothed her hair. And he understood, he had noticed the traces of past hurts in her eyes, the careful way she measured trust. He didn't want to rush her. He wanted to be the kind of presence that could, slowly, quietly, make those walls feel unnecessary. As they talked, a small misunderstanding crept in. Perhaps it was a word spoken too quickly, or a look misread in the soft light of the cafe, but suddenly the fragile balance shifted. She pulled slightly back, her voice clipped, almost apologetic. "I can handle things on my own," she said, a subtle steel beneath the softness. He felt the sting of her words, but he didn't respond with defensiveness or frustration. Instead, he simply let her distance exist, keeping his gaze gentle, his tone calm. "I know you can," he replied quietly. "I just want to be here, if you'll let me." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, a silent exchange filled with everything they weren't saying aloud, the shared loneliness, the longing for connection, the cautious, unspoken attraction. It was a moment suspended in time, heavy with possibility and risk, and neither moved. He noticed the smallest details, the slight tremor of her fingers as she wrapped her hands around her mug, the faint catch in her breath, the way her lips parted slightly before she spoke. Each subtle cue drew him closer emotionally, though he remained physically still, respecting her space. When she finally looked away, the tension didn't vanish, it lingered like a charged note, leaving both aware of what neither had admitted. The desire to bridge the distance was there, tempered by patience and respect, simmering under the quiet canopy of mutual hesitation. By the time they left the cafe, walking along the dimly lit street, the unspoken tension had settled into a fragile truce. Their shoulders brushed lightly, fingers almost touching, hearts quietly aware of the pull between them. He wanted to tell her, to erase the invisible walls, but he only offered the warmth of his presence, hoping she might someday trust him enough to let it in. Tonight, the spark had been lit, a slow-burning flame of desire, careful and restrained, ready to grow if they allowed it. The weekend arrived quietly, with the soft golden glow of late afternoon spilling through the windows of her apartment. He had come over under the pretext of helping with a small task, organizing books, moving a lamp, adjusting a stubborn curtain. But beneath the practicality of the moment, there was something else, a slow, unspoken closeness that had been building between them over weeks, fragile yet undeniable. She moved around the room with a grace that seemed natural, almost effortless, but he noticed the small tells of tension she carried unconsciously, a tightened jaw when lifting something heavy, a quick inhale when balancing a stack of books. Without thinking, he stepped closer at the right moments, offering steadying hands, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, lightly resting a hand on her shoulder to guide her around a narrow corner. Each gesture was small, deliberate, and entirely without expectation, yet loaded with meaning. She caught herself noticing him in ways she hadn't before, the steady calm in his eyes, the ease with which he seemed to anticipate her movements, the quiet patience he extended without comment or judgment. Their interactions had become a dance, unhurried, nuanced, full of subtle cues. When she laughed at a minor mistake, he reached instinctively to steady her, fingers brushing hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't pull away. Instead, she felt the warmth of his touch linger, a grounding comfort that made her chest loosen in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Later, they sat side by side on the couch, a blanket draped loosely over their shoulders. She had her laptop open, pretending to work, but he noticed her leaning slightly toward him, drawn to the quiet presence beside her. Their knees brushed occasionally, small accidental contacts that sent a flutter through him each time. He felt the steady rhythm of her breathing, the subtle warmth of her body close to his, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the softness of the room. In moments like these, conversation was optional. Words hung between them, unspoken but understood. A glance, a gentle shift closer, a shared smile, these became the language of their intimacy. She rested her hand near his, not fully on him, but close enough that he could feel the tension leave her shoulders, the burden she had carried alone easing just a little under the quiet strength of his presence. He watched the way her eyes softened when she thought he wasn't looking, the slight smile that touched her lips when their hands brushed, the way she leaned into the space he offered without forcing closeness. It was slow, deliberate, and entirely natural, a tender physicality that spoke of trust, safety, and the first quiet stirrings of desire, all without words or overt gestures. By the time she closed her laptop, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in a soft, golden twilight. She turned to him, a quiet vulnerability in her gaze. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For just being here." He smiled, leaning slightly closer, allowing the warmth of his shoulder to brush against hers. "Always," he replied softly, letting the word carry the promise they both understood, that she didn't have to face her burdens alone anymore. In that small, unhurried space, surrounded by warmth, light, and quiet trust, the slow burn of their connection deepened, not with grand declarations, but with the intimacy of shared presence, gentle touch, and mutual understanding. The night was quiet, the city outside softened by a gentle drizzle that reflected the scattered glow of streetlights. They walked together along the narrow streets, umbrellas close but not quite touching, the proximity enough to feel the warmth of each other without forcing it. There was no rush, no need for grand gestures, the night itself seemed to cradle them, giving space for emotions that had been quietly building for weeks to surface naturally. She carried her own invisible weight, as she always did, but tonight it felt lighter. He noticed it in the way her shoulders moved, less rigid, more relaxed. Her laughter, low and unguarded, carried easily into the misty air, and for the first time in a long while, it felt free, not measured or self-protective, but simply hers. They stopped at a small bridge overlooking the river, the water reflecting golden lights like scattered fireflies. She leaned slightly against the railing, and without thinking, he stepped close, the space between them intimate yet unpressured. His hand hovered briefly near hers, and when their fingers brushed, it was neither accidental nor forced, just a natural acknowledgement of closeness. She didn't pull away, she let it linger, a quiet acceptance that spoke louder than words ever could. "You know," she began softly, her voice carrying a mixture of hesitation and warmth, "I've spent so long thinking no one could handle all of this." She gestured vaguely toward herself, toward the invisible baggage she carried. "But tonight, it doesn't feel so heavy anymore." He didn't speak immediately. He simply let her words settle between them, letting the silence affirm what neither had said outright, that trust had been earned, that care had been given, that hearts could be shared without fear. Then he said gently, "You never had to carry it alone. Not tonight, not ever. And if you let me, I'll always be here to share it with you." Her lips curved into a soft, genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened every line of guardedness she had carried. She turned slightly toward him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder, just enough to feel the warmth and steadiness of his presence. He didn't move, didn't speak, he simply allowed her to lean there, letting the quiet intimacy speak for itself. They stood that way for several moments, the world around them fading into soft shadows and gentle reflections. The rain pattered lightly against their umbrellas, a soothing rhythm that matched the calm steadiness of their shared heartbeat. In that small, unhurried space, every lingering glance, every subtle touch, every quiet breath conveyed what words could not: connection, trust, care, and the beginning of love that grew not from urgency, but from patience and understanding. Finally, she lifted her head, eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, a silent promise that the walls she had so carefully maintained were no longer barriers, only bridges. He smiled, his fingers brushing hers once more before letting them rest naturally at his side, content to walk beside her in quiet companionship. Tonight, the baggage hadn't disappeared, it didn't need to. What mattered was that it was shared. And in sharing, in gentle closeness and unspoken understanding, they found something far heavier than fear or doubt, the weightless certainty of having found someone who would always carry it with them. The slow burn romance had reached its resolution, quiet, warm, and profoundly human, leaving both hearts lighter, closer, and irrevocably intertwined.